Hi, everyone. Welcome, and we are going to get started in a couple of minutes. Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in about 2 minutes. From Afghanistan to Minneapolis, do U.S. wars ever really end? You're in the right place. Just hold on 2 more minutes.
Good evening, comrades and friends. Welcome to Workers' World Party's weekly broadcast, where hundreds of revolutionaries from across the world gather to strategize, to analyze, and to build the struggle for a socialist future, a workers' world. Tonight, we have an exciting panel of revolutionaries and anti-war activists from across the country. I'm one of your hosts tonight, Nate Chase, and I'm a member of the New York City branch of Workers' World Party. Our webinar tonight is entitled From Afghanistan to Minneapolis, Do U.S. Wars Ever End? We're gathered tonight in the aftermath of the guilty verdict in the trial of Derek Chauvin for the racist police murder of George Floyd. We know that this guilty verdict is not the result of some just criminal justice system, but rather a response, a concession to the extraordinary uprisings that have taken place since the racist police murder of George Floyd. It shows the power of the people. And yet we know that the struggle does not end, that this verdict does not stop police terror. As if to illustrate the point, just as the verdict was being announced, police in Columbus, Ohio, murdered a 16-year-old Black girl, Ma'Khia Bryant. We say her name, Ma'Khia Bryant. As U.S. imperialism carries out racist terror at home, it carries it out abroad. U.S. troops have occupied Afghanistan for nearly 20 years. February 29th, 2020, the U.S. and Taliban forces agreed for all U.S. troops to withdraw by this May 1st. Yet Biden has recently announced pushing this withdrawal date back to September 11th. The withdrawal risks an increase and resumption of hostilities, which can then justify an even further delay of the withdrawal. And we know that in any case, a withdrawal is in fact a replacement of official military troops with private military contractors. Why is the US incapable of ending these racist imperialist occupations from Minneapolis to Afghanistan to Haiti to Puerto Rico? What will it take for working and oppressed peoples of the world to put an end to them? We have a wonderful panel assembled tonight to discuss them. Joining me as my co-host is Judy Greenspan of the San Francisco Bay Area branch of Workers' World Party. If you could take a second to go to Workers' World Party's Facebook page and share the live video of this event with your friends, that would help enormously for us to reach more members of the class. Links to YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook will be put in the chat for those watching on Zoom. Please do share those links. Before we begin tonight's program, I'd like to invite Sarah Flounders, co-director of the International Action Center, to give a brief tribute to Ramsay Clark. Ramsay passed away this month at the age of 93 and was the founder of the International Action Center. Longer and more extensive memorial events will be announced in the coming weeks and months. We felt at this time that it would be appropriate for Sarah to give a brief tribute in his honor. Sarah?
Thanks so much. And we're taking up a big topic, but opening with a tribute to a man who is known around the world for speaking out, traveling to US war zones, taking great personal risks to expose the crimes of US imperialism. Ramsay Clark died April 9th at the age of 93, an enormously full life. He's remembered as a former US Attorney General and probably the only member of a presidential cabinet who didn't trade his position, his cabinet position, into multi-million-dollar advisor to corporate power. Instead, he used his name, his reputation, his legal skills to defend the most oppressed, the most demonized, isolated, and targeted. From death row cases in Texas, so many US political prisoners, to countries under US bombs and drones and sanctions all around the world. And always he was stressing the power is in the people for change. Now, he was motivated, driven by the conviction that if millions of people knew, if they saw, if they grasped the crimes of US power, they would be committed to forcing the changes. And he identified with everyone who was fighting this brutal system. He really identified with them. During the wars, he would be at bomb sites, in hospitals, where civilians' lives had been shredded, were homeless or living in tents, where children were starved and displaced. He wanted that known here in the US and denounced around the world. So there will be time for tribute by many, many voices in the weeks ahead. Just to take a minute tonight to ask anyone who wants to post a tribute to Ramsay Clark to please, hopefully you can put it on the screen also, a tribute to the International Action Center's website, iacenter.org, and then just Ramsay Clark tribute, or just go to the center. Also, and it's important we begin this way, but to say that we truly believe that you honor the dead and fight like hell for the living. And we're going to be closing tonight's program with an update on the health of a revolutionary fighter, Mumia Abu-Jamal. So let's fight like hell for the living. Let's fight for Mumia, and please send tributes to memories of Ramsay Clark to the International Action Center, iacenter.org. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. At this time, I'd like to introduce our first panelist for this evening. We're going to hear from Angel Smith-L. She's one of the leaders of the Twin Cities Coalition for Justice for Jamar. Angel, please take it away. Thank you.
Hello, can y'all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Angel. We can't see you yet. If you're able to turn on your camera.
There we go. Okay.
Great.
It wasn't letting me do it at first. How y'all doing? So my name is Angel Smith-Ill. I am with the Twin Cities Coalition Justice for Jamar here in the great state of Minneapolis, Minnesota, where the groundbreaking trial for Chauvin was at. I could definitely start off with that. Our city basically turned into a complete military zone. There's like National Guard, all different types of police from different states, not just our own, but like Ohio and other places. And under our governor and our mayor, Governor Tim Walz and Mayor Jacob Fry, decided that they were going to have Operation Safety Net. Ha! Safety net for who? Not for the people, right? Definitely to protect the businesses, the big buildings and all that stuff, but definitely not for the people. They wanted to bring in all this National Guard, basically block off streets. Everything downtown Minneapolis is crazy, like blocked off. Like our government center is like embarked into like fences and concrete barricades and razor wire, everything, you name it. I mean, they spent millions of dollars. And here we are in the middle of a pandemic and also have people living in tents and not finding affordable housing for people. But we can spend millions of dollars to bring the military and police into our communities and try to kill protesters or hurt protesters. So days before Chauvin's verdict, the police in a rural a community outside of Minneapolis, Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, was a young man who's about 20 years old was killed by Brooklyn Center Police Department for a cop named Kim Potter, who didn't know the difference between her taser and her gun. She's yelling out taser, but grabs her gun and shoots him in the heart, kills him. She says it's a mistake. They pulled him over for having air fresheners in his rearview mirror. And basically a young Black man driving a nice, beautiful white car. And that was days before. And literally, like, it was give them a reason to use their flashbangs and to target protesters. And of course, people are going to take to the streets about it because it was an unnecessary killing of another young Black man. And we haven't even gotten over the George Floyd case yet, or Chauvin's case, because it's not, George Floyd's not on trial, but Chauvin. So we're dealing with two threads here, and at the same time dealing with the militarized police in our neighborhoods, not just in downtown Minneapolis, but also on our streets and our neighborhoods, all over South Minneapolis, some in St. Paul, some at the fairgrounds while you're trying to get vaccinated for COVID. It's just unnecessarily, just definitely unnecessary craziness. The people in Brooklyn Center, a lot of youth, which stood up and fought back for Dante Wright. That's the young man that was killed. Were out there and had gotten tear gas, maced, rubber bullets shot at them, concussion grenades. Just the excessive amount of stuff used on these people, on protesters, was just crazy. It was ridiculous. And then, of course, we did opening arguments. We've pulled like tons and tons of people to the streets for each day. But of course, when the verdict came up on Tuesday, Everybody was downtown Minneapolis quickly. And we got a small victory by getting, on all three accounts, guilty verdict for Chauvin, which is amazing. And it is something to celebrate, but in the same sense, we know that there's still more fighting to be done, and there is still more police that we need to be held accountable here in Minnesota. There is a list that we have of over 500 people on a poster that have been murdered by Minneapolis and St. Paul Police Department. And a lot of those cases were, not cases that definitely went viral because there was no body cams or anything like that, or they're older cases, but it doesn't mean that their lives didn't matter, and definitely want to hold those killer cops accountable. So we still have more work to do. We have a small victory in getting Chauvin. He's only like the second police officer in the state of Minnesota to actually be convicted. The other one was African American. Well, he was Somalian, for killing a white woman here in Minnesota, also, who was from Australia. And we all know why that case happened and why that person why that cop went to jail. So it's definitely been a victory for us, but we're still going to remain out in the streets. And as far as what TC4J wants to do is to basically what we call community control of the police, CPAC. That is an all council of the community, and we decide, hire and fire who polices our communities. And we're doing work on that. And so we're definitely trying to get CPAC out there. And that's kind of our answer right now to the police situation. So we can start holding killer cops accountable for killing our community members of color. And so, yeah, if you guys got anything else, I'm happy to help.
Thank you so much, Angel, for your, and we'll be hearing from you a little later. We'll be having some other questions coming on. So maybe I'll be somewhere in the screen here. Okay, so I am Judy Greenspan, and I am co-hosting tonight's program. Angel's talk reminds me of a lot of things that are happening right now in the world. And first and fundamentally, I think what Angel described reminds me of what's happening around the country in terms of US occupying troops. Because as you know, the National Guard was called out not only in, interesting, it was called out not only in Minneapolis, but it was also called out all around the country. One of the places where I believe 1,000 National Guard troops were called is the city of Philadelphia. And the city of Philadelphia, there will be a major set of actions and demonstrations to support Mumia Abu-Jamal. Mumia Abu-Jamal, which many of you know, and I'm not going to go into his case because it's, hopefully you'll be able to look it up and you'll be able to find more information. Go to the mobilization for Mumia and you can get lots of information. But Mumia Abu-Jamal, who has been in prison for 40 years, almost died this past week. He was basically kidnapped from the prison where he has been incarcerated, taken to the hospital. Nobody knew. His family didn't know, his supporters, his lawyer, his spiritual advisor, no one knew what had happened. He had, obviously, they discovered he had very serious heart problems, and they scheduled him for open heart surgery. Now, When you're a prisoner, when you're someone behind the walls, and when you're someone as high profile as Mumia Abu-Jamal, you are not treated very well in terms of the way, in relationship to if you weren't incarcerated. And Mumia Abu-Jamal was shackled to the bed, to the hospital bed. And I believe that his surgery was done with him being shackled, and that he is currently still in the hospital. His surgery was successful from what we understand. He did talk to his wife. But Mumia has many, many medical complications. And Mumia is someone who the ruling class in this country will never forgive. He was framed for a crime he did not commit, but he took on the cases of people nobody would champion. He took on support of the MOVE family. He took on the city of Philadelphia. And, when I think about what's going on now in Minneapolis and what is going on in Brooklyn Center, and I think about, every day now we are hearing about another Black or brown person who has been shot and assassinated by the police. This is so much what Mumia's case is all about. And I know that Mumia is probably thinking of ways that he can, for his next commentary, talk about the struggles that are going on in the street against racism, but also the struggles that are going on against US the militarization around the world. Because Workers' World Party has always said that there is a connection between the war at home, between poor and oppressed people, and the wars abroad in terms of the US military. So I think we're going to definitely dive very deeply into all of these questions tonight. So our next speaker, we are very honored to have on our program, Ronda Romero, who is the chairperson of Bion USA. Ronda, I want to start by asking you a question. How is US militarization ramping up in the Philippines right now? And how is this connected to US warmongering with China?
Hi, Judy. Thanks for having me on this webinar. It's really an honor to be here and to follow Sarah's tribute to the great Ramsay Clark and to follow Angel's remarks at the beginning. And what Angel was talking about, the militarization in Minneapolis, really makes me think about the way different police forces in the US have done joint training with the national police in the Philippines. And so to me, it's really no surprise that the violence being rained down on working and oppressed people in the United States in many different cities looks so much like the way the Philippine President Duterte has carried out his war on drugs and his war on activists in the Philippines over the past several years, knowing that these trainings go on between police forces, between the military of the US and the Philippines, and really have been for decades. A lot of times people ask me, so are you hopeful for change under Biden? And I've been saying US foreign policy toward the Philippines has been the same since 1898, since the US decided they wanted the Philippines as a colony. So whether the president has been Republican or Democrat, whether the president in the Philippines has been a dictator like Ferdinand Marcos in the 70s up to the 80s, or a so-called democracy icon like Cory Aquino after that. Really, US foreign policy has always been about protecting and advancing US imperialist interests in our country and throughout the region. And so, the Philippines being a country of 100 million people, 10 million of which are actually abroad because the country is so poor after, so many decades of US colonization and neo-colonization, still today we're a neo-colony and we're poor. And in order to keep the people from rising up and being able to overthrow the system that oppresses them, you see this massive militarization by both the police and the armed forces throughout the country. So to your question, Judy, what's happening today? It's really intensifying and getting worse. And again, no surprise, because so when you turn on the news in this country here in the US, we're hearing about, of course, the trial of Derek Chauvin and the police killings of Black and brown people. And then you flip the switch and you're also hearing about US competition with China and all this finger pointing and warmongering with China, which is being identified by the imperialists as the number one enemy of the US right now. And the way that plays out in terms of the Philippines is increased US military presence in our country, increased US and Philippine patrols and exercises off our coast, increase ships in public ports in the Philippines, increased, boots on the ground, even though the US is not supposed to have military bases in our country. It's a direct violation of sovereignty. You know, when Biden took office, within a couple of weeks, he made this. He and the State Department put out some remarks on America's place in the world, or what they called America's place in the world, and it was all about the U.S. competition with China and other countries that it sees as rivals. One thing that Biden said, and I'll quote this: American leadership must meet this new moment of advancing authoritarianism, including the growing ambitions of China to rival the United States. We'll take on directly the challenges posed by our prosperity, security, and democratic values by our most serious competitor, China. And then, within a week, the new U.S. Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, made a phone call to the Defense Secretary of the Philippines to reaffirm their longstanding friendship, the longstanding friendship between the U.S. and the Philippines, and to very clearly reaffirm military agreements between the two countries. So it became very clear to us, within the first, 3 weeks of the Biden administration, that the U.S. had no intention of changing its relationship with our country, of lessening any support for the, wannabe dictator that we have in power right now, President Duterte, despite his atrocious human rights record. And so while people around the world are condemning the bloody war on drugs that he's carried out using his armed forces and his police, upwards of 30,000 people being slaughtered on the street, just because the police, are labeling them as drug dealers or drug users, and the war that they're carrying out on activists who they're labeling as terrorists, including, just to say, myself. On their Facebook pages, they've actually clearly labeled myself and other leaders of Buy in USA, calling us terrorists and calling our organization a front for terrorism. So while they do this, the U.S. is continuing to supply money through military aid to the Philippine military and police to carry out their war against the people. One other thing I want to mention is, just a couple of weeks ago, the U.S. convened something they called the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or the Quad, with the heads of state of Australia, Japan, and India, in order to push forth what they're calling like their Pacific Deterrence Initiative. Again, it's all about China. And the US has been expanding its Pacific Area Command. So this is the military command that covers the Philippines, which, in the past had received anywhere from, $4 to $6 billion a year to operate. But the Biden administration has asked for $27 billion for the next budget. And so, it's to us, that means you'll have more US military focused in the region, more US military in our country, and more US military support for dictators like Duterte, regardless of his human rights record, simply because the US wants to continue using the Philippines as a base of operations, or as a place in their, what they call their island chain, the US, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Okinawa, so that they can launch aggression towards China. What's the solution? The solution is what it's always been, and that is the people rising up and fighting it. And that's what we're going to continue to do. And what we want to do with you all is build that solidarity of our movements fighting against US war making, US militarization on the streets in the US and in countries around the world like the Philippines. So thank you for having me here tonight.
Thanks so much for your remarks, Rhonda. I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Makasi Motema, who is a contributing editor for Workers' World newspaper. Makasi, considering the incredibly negative publicity and social unrest caused by police killings, why hasn't the state made any attempt to stop them from killing people?
Yeah, the answer to that is because they can't. The idea that the police are sort of a force to provide security, and that if we can reform them or train them in terms of de-escalation and community policing so that they can have a positive relationship with people of color, this doesn't have a basis in material reality. The actual purpose of the police in the United States and really anywhere where police are formed is to protect the interests of the capitalist ruling class. So, you can look at the history of it. You can look at the history in the U.S. of police being formed as slave catchers, but also in Great Britain when police were created, it was very clearly done to prevent workers from rioting and taking wealth from the capitalist ruling class. You needed someone who could patrol a community, keep an eye on a community, and break up any kind of really organizing. One of the things that we talk about a lot in the left is, stop and frisk. That a particularly young Black man is walking down the street and they're stopped and harassed. They're especially likely to be stopped and harassed if they've congregated in a group of 3 or more people. And why is that? That's being done because the police want to establish that if you congregate in large groups, we have a problem with it and we can make your life miserable. But congregating in large groups is the first step for organizing. It's the first step for people having conversations about their conditions and the things that they don't like about the world, and eventually getting to, well, what is the solution and how do we unite and how do we actually fight back? So that's the actual role that the police play. Why can't they stop killing people? So Workers' World Party actually put out a book called Turn the Guns Around. And it talks about situations where soldiers have stopped defending the government and sided with uprisings and rebellions and revolutions. In Russia in 1905, I think it was thousands of protesters marched on the Tsar's palace, and there were a line of troops in front of these protesters, and the protesters were demanding, they were all workers, and they were demanding better conditions because their working conditions were horrible. And eventually the order was given for the troops to open fire on the protesters, and they did. And the massacre was called Bloody Sunday. It is very difficult to get a human being to murder another unarmed human being, right? But if the masses of workers in the United States rise up and attempt to reappropriate the wealth that capitalists have stolen from them, that's exactly what you would need the police force to do. So let's think about what qualities in a police officer don't allow you to do that, right? Viewing people that you patrol as a human being, establishing a relationship with them, establishing trust. These are all things that make it very hard to kill someone, right? So whenever politicians get on television and tell you that that's what we need to train cops to do to de-escalate, to calm tensions, to build relationships, you know that they're not saying anything that's remotely close to the truth. Now, what does help you kill someone is thinking of yourself as a combatant in a war zone, viewing every person you see as a possible threat, as someone who can draw a weapon that's concealed at any time and attack you unprovoked, or telling you that, listen, at the start of your shift, the one thing you need to remember, the one goal you need to have, is to get home alive, right? Because you're telling the person that they're going into a war zone, and if someone is standing between you and getting home alive, they need to be killed. And those qualities are exactly the qualities that in department after department across the entire country, police have been inundated with. They call it the warrior mentality, which tells you everything you need to know about how they think about these things. Um, and they do that because it will make for effective killers, and it will make for effective killers of the working class, should they choose to rise up. So we're in a situation right now where the capitalist ruling class has no reason to stop police from doing this, but also that it would be irrational. Another reason why it would be irrational is because you don't beat your guard dog, right? Like, that's pretty stupid. If you have a dog that's guarding your house and you start hitting it, it's probably going to stop protecting you, and it might bite you. The police have guns and politicians don't. So they're not really in a position to um, criminalize their own security guards, right? These things offend them. If you remember back, there was a funeral for 2 police officers in New York City, and because Bill de Blasio had said some very milquetoast comment about interactions between Black people and the police and how that affected his son, hundreds of police officers turned their back on him during a funeral, to express their disapproval of him while he was giving a eulogy. So they make it very clear. They make it very clear what it is they're being trained to do, and what the consequences will be if you cross them. I mean, you can also ask David Dinkins, who had to deal with a police riot in the early 1990s. So the other aspect to this is that, well, okay, they did punish one police officer. The question of this conviction, the question of justice, is completely and totally irrelevant to the state. The state didn't convict Derek Chauvin because they felt it was the right thing to do, because they looked at what he had done and thought he's really a murderer and we need to establish justice. They did that because of the outpouring of rage from the working class. Frankly, they did that because the 3rd precinct in Minneapolis was burned down. And you don't have to take my word for this. You can actually see a very clear dichotomy. After Eric Garner and Michael Brown were killed, there were protests. Sometimes there was extreme conflict. Maybe a few windows were broken, and what you saw were politicians come out to condemn protesters for being violent or undisciplined in some way and not expressing their grief properly. But then in Dallas, a Black man during a protest shot and killed, I think, 8 police officers. And the reaction I saw from the political class and from the media the next day, I'll never forget it for the rest of my life, because I thought they were going to come on and talk about how horrendous this act was, and that this person was a terrorist, and that there's absolutely no excuse for violence, because that was what they were giving to protesters who were totally unarmed. But instead, they came out and said, this is a serious issue. Police brutality is a serious issue, and people are hurt, and we're begging folks to not take the law into their own hands. So they came out and let you know, basically, what they listen to and what they don't. And we're going to see more of that. So the conclusion, I guess, is I'll wrap up by saying this. I wouldn't expect to see more police convictions. I think, this was damage control. I think what you'll probably see over the long term is more funding, and also maybe public-private partnerships with NGOs and stuff like that, doing some of the soft police work to reduce their presence. But the violence isn't going away.
Thank you so much, Makasi, very much for your comments. A lot of food for thought. So for our next speaker, we're very excited to be joined by a comrade from Youth Against Empire and the Minneapolis Anti-War Committee, Autumn Lake. Autumn, can you talk about how US policies abroad are part of the same system as US policies at home?
I would be more than happy to do that. So first of all, hello everyone. Once again, my name is Autumn. I have the unique honor of serving as a member of the Anti-War Committee based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, as well as representing Youth Against Empire, which is a national working group of anti-imperialist youth that is coordinated with the United National Anti-War Coalition. Being an anti-imperialist organizer at ground zero of a national uprising against police violence, against police killings, did a lot to illuminate for a lot of people just how thoroughly connected U.S. aggression abroad is with U.S. aggression in communities in the United States. But I want to point out, it's not just a connection, right? The U.S. imperialism doesn't exist within its own exclusive bubble. It's foundational to the political and economic system of the United States and is a critical part of every other means of oppression at the disposal of the United States. We see this frequently in the cause of immigrant justice. Refugees, asylum seekers, and other migrants tend to hail from areas that have been devastated by the effects of U.S. foreign policy. We don't even have to look that far back. Just a couple of years ago, we had a massive caravan of asylum seekers from Honduras, which had its democratically elected government overthrown during the Obama administration in 2009. This undid a lot of the social progress. This led to unrest, lots of violence, especially against the women. This is what fueled that refugee caravan. It fueled the ongoing struggle for immigrant justice here in the United States. Likewise, in so many other areas of the world that the U.S. Intervenes in, we'll use Iraq, for example. The people who kind of bear the brunt of U.S. aggression are the type of people that we tend to advocate for in our own social justice struggles here in the United States. Women, children, the working class, indigenous peoples, they tend to face the harshest consequences of U.S. imperialism. Another example of this is in Venezuela. In 2018, just 2018 alone, 40,000 Venezuelans had died as a result of U.S. sanctions on the country. The overwhelming majority of those sanctions deprived resources from Afro-Venezuelans and indigenous Venezuelans, Black and indigenous folks living in Venezuela. Which means it's not just U.S. imperialism isn't just some sort of, blanket phenomenon. It always tends to affect and target the very same groups that we advocate for here in the United States. In addition, the United States tends to uphold regimes that engage in the same oppressive practices as the United States. For example, the Israeli apartheid regime is probably the strongest example of this. Their ongoing occupation of Palestine and the seizure of Palestinian land is not unlike the ongoing occupation of indigenous land here in the United States, with land seizures still occurring, with destruction of remaining indigenous lands ongoing, with construction of pipelines and things of that nature. The way imperialism intensifies various other forms of oppression faced all around the world is also it also amplifies those same forms of oppression here. And what the United States will also do is it sort of plays both sides of these issues, right? Because on one hand, it is directly oppressive in these explicit ways, but on the other hand, sometimes they'll utilize the language of human rights, utilize the language of equality, the language of progressivism to kind of justify its imperialist aims. Again, Israel is the kind of the main example here, because the United States will often uplift it as sort of a paragon of human rights in the Middle East. Oh yeah, they have all these rights. They advance causes for women, they advance causes for LGBTQ folks, and first of all, like so many politicians in Israel proper absolutely do not have the interest of LGBTQ folks in mind. But additionally, I know the U.S. government doesn't have the real interest of LGBTQ people in mind. Not even remotely. We've seen massive scale backs of the rights for trans kids, trans adults, all across the United States for years, and even ongoing under the Biden administration in places like Arkansas. So for the United States to say, oh yeah, no, this is one of the good places for LGBTQ rights, we should know. Like, no, you absolutely should not know. You are the last person who should know, actually. Likewise, when it comes to, claiming that Israel is a paragon for women's justice, there are feminist movements in Iran. There's a major secular movement and a major religious-based feminist movement, and both maintain that women's rights, the advancement of women's rights in the region can only be attained with the end of U.S. imperialism, because that is the primary force acting upon people in those countries. Now, the sort of interwoven nature of violence abroad and violence at home is really deeply felt when it comes to the movement for Black lives in the United States. And this is because the war on Black lives is a global war. The atrocities that the U.S. commits throughout the African continent and countries with significant Black populations such as Venezuela, or majority Black populations such as Haiti, it also commits domestically. One example we have here in Minnesota, for example, we have the largest Somali population outside of the country of Somalia due to a U.S. engineered refugee crisis. U.S. intervention in Somalia really hit a high point, in 1992 to 1995, but continues to this day, with drone strikes being a regular occurrence all across the country. Some of the cities most notorious for police violence, including Minneapolis, have had their own police forces work with Israeli occupiers in order to enhance these police forces' own ability to act as occupiers, to enhance their ability to, do their own policing jobs. It trains them in, as has been mentioned before, the sort of warrior ethos to police work here in the United States. And now in this particular moment for the struggle of Black lives, military vehicles belonging to both National Guard and several police departments throughout Minnesota have become an unsurprising sight here in Minneapolis. And it makes it more apparent than ever that Black communities in the U.S. and the U.S. targets abroad are subject to the same kinds of violence. These are not inseparable forms of violence. They are cohesive parts of a single system at work. It is not a flaw of the system. It is not a mistake. It is not an oversight. It is foundational to how the United States operates in the first place. It's for that reason that I think it's really important for all of us to continue to illuminate and expand upon these connections and the way these issues are interwoven, in order to make it clear that all struggles for peace and justice must necessarily be struggles against U.S. imperialism. Thank you.
Thank you, Autumn. Thank you for your remarks. I'd like to introduce our next guest, our next panelist. We're really honored to have with us Jeremy Kuzmarov. Have him on our live stream tonight. He's the managing editor of Covert Action magazine, and recently wrote an excellent article on Afghanistan that was published in the Gray Zone. Jeremy, we've heard that the U.S. is withdrawing from Afghanistan, but is the U.S. really going to leave?
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, but we can't see you yet.
Oh, I'm trying to do start video and it's not working.
I'm going to need somebody, one of the tech people, to request that Jeremy turn his camera on.
There. Okay. Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to be here. Yeah, in answer to your question, well, the New York Times has a clear answer for that question. In a front page article, the big headline was Biden announced withdrawal. But if you read the article, the long article, it reported, more towards the end of the article, the United States would remain after the formal departure of U.S. troops with a shadowy combination of clandestine special operations forces, Pentagon contractors, and covert intelligence operatives. Their mission will be to find and attack the most dangerous Qaeda or Islamic State threats, current and former American officials said. So American officials are admitting that they're not leaving. The Times further reported that the United States maintains a constellation of air bases in the Persian Gulf region as well as in Jordan, and a major air headquarters in Qatar, which could provide a launching pad for long-range bomber or armed drone missions into Afghanistan. So we have a clear indication that the United States is not leaving. And the meaningless of President Biden's announcement, and these are excellent examples of the American imperial presence in the Middle East. And we know how that's impacted the region in the last decades. We've seen the mess that is caused by that military presence. The meaningless of President Biden's announcement becomes apparent when we consider that the Pentagon employs more than 7 contractors for every serviceman or woman in Afghanistan, an increase of 1 contractor for every serviceman or woman a decade ago. As of January, there are more than 18,000 contractors in Afghanistan, according to a Defense Department report. These people are going to stay there. And that's a way that the U.S., that's the imperial strategy after Vietnam, when most of the American public turned against U.S. wars and started to question what it was all about. The U.S. has been able to sustain its imperial power through this light footprint approach. And by employing what are mercenary, they call them private military contractors, but they're in fact mercenaries. And they do what U.S. soldiers will do. And one of these companies, DynCorp, has received over $7 billion in government contract to train the Afghan army and manage military bases in Afghanistan. Forbes called it one of the biggest winners of the Iraq and Afghan wars, the losers being just about everybody else. And a blueprint for U.S. strategy in Afghanistan is the secret war in Laos. Is not as well known aspect of the Indochina wars, where the CIA worked with hundreds of civilian contractors who flew spotter aircraft, ran ground bases, and operated radar stations in civilian clothes, while raising its own private army among the Hmong to fight the pro-communist Pathet Lao. And that's the strategy the U.S. will be pursuing in future years in Afghanistan. They've already, for years, been recruiting tribal elements there, and like in Laos, have become enmeshed in intertribal and sectarian feuds. For years, U.S. Special Forces operatives have also been training Afghan security forces, and the U.S. Spends $4 billion every year training those Afghan security forces, who are known for abhorrent behavior, including systematic torture and war crimes and human rights abuses, as well as incompetence. They've had record number of defections, so it's really a waste of our taxpayer dollar. But we've been doing this for years, and this is going to continue. Congress has to cut the aid, and we haven't seen a wherewithal from Congress to do so. So this is going to continue to train these security forces as essentially a U.S. proxy army and running Phoenix-style snatch and grab and assassination missions. You could read a book by Anand Gopal, documented this some years ago. This has been going on for many years now, where they're leading these kind of missions to snatch and grab. And often they're taking the wrong people and torturing them and killing the wrong people, as in the Vietnam Phoenix operation. And all this is going to continue. And I end my article, with the question, what, Uncle Sam, what does it really want in Afghanistan? Why is the U.S. going to be staying there? And the answer, I think, has to do less with the threat of terrorism. In the media, they always raise the question of terrorism and will terrorism increase if the U.S. leaves? A lot of articles suggest. I think the evidence would show the U.S. is a primary source, the U.S. true presence of terrorism. In fact, most leading studies of terrorism find that terrorism takes root under foreign military occupations. So if you want to, it's kind of basic logic. If you actually want to stop terrorism, don't occupy countries, but that would make sense. What the U.S. really wants is the access to military bases. It's been announced that the U.S. will retain at least 2 military bases in Afghanistan. They have many, probably will retain more. They have many dozens of bases there currently. Uncle Sam also covets Afghan's mineral wealth. A 2000 U.S. Geological Service survey discovered nearly $1 trillion in mineral deposits, including huge amounts of iron, copper, cobalt, gold, and critical industrial metals like lithium, which is used in the manufacture of batteries for laptops and Blackberries. An internal Pentagon memo stated that Afghanistan could become the Saudi Arabia of lithium. And at the time of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, which if we had more time, I could go in more depth a discussion of that and whether it was legal or not. Actually, most international legal experts find it was illegal for the U.S. to have invaded and occupied in the first place. For it to have been legal, the Taliban would have had to have sent the 9/11 hijackers, which was never proven at all. In fact, the Taliban were willing to have them tried in court. In any event, at that time, the U.S. was trying to expand its military infrastructure into Central Asia. Afghanistan provided a key way station to this new oil dorado, which holds as much as 200 billion barrels of oil, 10 times the amount found in the North Sea and a third of the Persian Gulf's total reserves. Afghanistan was further valued at the time as a key location for an oil pipeline that would transport Central Asian oil to the Indian Ocean while bypassing Russia. And increasingly, we see a kind of great game of competition because Russia has tried to take advantage of the situation in Afghanistan and is expanding its own presence in the country and has established some cultural centers. Of course, Russia is not going to make the same mistake they did before and invade Afghanistan, but they are trying to increase their influence and economic influence in the country. And this is really what alarmed the U.S. ruling elite, as well as China. Yeah, China has been increasing trade and investment in Afghanistan, with which it shares a border, and has sought to cultivate better relations with the Afghan government and Taliban. So I think that's what Uncle Sam fears ultimately, is a loss of influence in this key, geostrategic country, in the Middle East. And because of that, the U.S. will continue to pump in money to the Afghan government, including the $4 billion in security assistance. And this will continue unless Congress cuts it. And they're going to keep the Ghani regime, try and sustain that regime. That regime is a morally bankrupt regime, which is a creation of the United States. It is viewed as a foreign puppet regime by many Afghans. It has, I can go on about that, but I don't want to take up too much more time. So it's really not a regime with any credibility, but the U.S. is trying to sustain it with huge amounts of foreign aid, money we need at home to address urgent social problems here, the poverty, the education crisis. So, but it's really about the U.S. empire, and that's we're all trying to form a movement to fight U.S. empire and its evils. And as long as that empire persists, we're going to have endless wars in places like Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, for your remarks. We really appreciate them. And your article was linked in the chat, so people should definitely check that out. Okay, so before I welcome Sarah Flounders back, I would like to invite everyone on Zoom to put your questions in the Q&A. You can also make comments on the other social, then the Q&A is at the bottom of your Zoom page. And you can also make comments on YouTube, on other social media platforms, YouTube and Twitter. Now let's welcome back Sarah Flounders for her remarks about Afghanistan. Besides being co-director of the International Action Center, Sarah is a frequent contributor to Workers' World newspaper. She is also the co-editor of the new book, Capitalism on a Ventilator, The Impact of COVID-19 in China and the US. And I'm going to ask the tech to drop in the book ordering information, as well as to bring up our next speaker. Sarah.
Thank you. I want to really address why do the wars never end? I think that's the big question that each of the speakers has been answering, has been talking about. They're really incapable, even if they wanted to, they are incapable of ending the wars. Because this, and we can't just denounce the wars one by one or deal with only one. It's a system that is built on violence. Capitalism is built on systemic racism, on the slave trade, on colonialism, on genocide of indigenous people. It's built on the theft of labor and of land. And that concentration in fewer and fewer hands, on monopoly hands, that's imperialism today. They want to, and they do, rule the world. And it is a ruthless process. And they know that they can't hold on one day without a military machine, without violence. They understand this, and it's important for us to understand it too. It's why it can't be reformed, and it can't be just wished away. You can't enforce the inequality of property without greater and greater levels of military threat, because that gap is growing in monumental ways between the billionaire trillionaires and those who really have nothing, not one paycheck ahead. And it's staggering levels of destruction around the world and also in communities right here. Largest prison population, what a destruction that is. Largest number of people in solitary confinement. So it is an empire that is enforced by violence, by military occupation around the world and in every community in the US. And you can't reform that. Its purpose is violence. Now, look at Afghanistan. There are 100.25 million US NATO troops that have cycled through Afghanistan, a country the size of Texas, and millions of mercenaries and contractors. Now, there was a treaty reached between the Taliban and US officials after months of negotiations, a treaty in Doha that agreed, that was in February 29th, 2020, that US troops would leave Afghanistan in 14 months by May 1st. All US NATO troops from 36 countries. And in return, during those 14 months, the Taliban would not attack US troops or provincial capitals. They have the capacity. There's not one US base today that is safe in Afghanistan. So we're almost at May 1st. What happened? On April 6th, Biden announced as a great victory that he would break that May 1st deadline and leave on September 11th. Now, this is one more example. The United States has never, ever, I defy anyone to come up with one treaty that the US made with any oppressed nation or people that they didn't openly and arrogantly violate. And here it is again. I'm so glad that Jeremy addressed the way in which they're already openly, it's in the newspapers, scheming how US troops and contractors and mercenaries and CIA and two bases, will stay in Afghanistan. Complete violation of what they agreed to on paper. So it's not only the date that is in violation, but they're even leaving. There's been 20 years of direct occupation in Afghanistan and 40 years of arming the most corrupt reactionary forces against what was a people's uprising, a massive people's uprising in 1979. And the US made it clear that they were willing to literally rip the whole country apart and inflame national antagonisms rather than allow a revolutionary upsurge to succeed. It was the US who first intervened. It's always important to remember that, even in looking at it historically. But fast forward 40 years, the Taliban in Doha, and to this day, and it's published, and the New York Times just ran an article on it. They have a checklist, an Excel spreadsheet of every US violation of the past 14 months. And you read it, and it looks like the more than 1,000 police murders that there have been in the US this year. In other words, it's one after the other, and each time the US government officials say, no, that was an insurgent, that was this person was armed. And on the other side, they say, no, this was a wedding party. This was a family asleep in their home. This was a mother and her 3 children. So the difference in story reads exactly the same, along with the constant, there are about 1,000 cases that the Taliban has presented. And I thought of the 1,000 deaths. You look at during the trial in Minneapolis, 20 days of trial, there were 64 US police killings in that time. It's staggering. And it shows how systemic the violence is. There also, just to make a point, that there was last year, December 2019, what were called the Afghan papers, released by the Washington Post, based on an expose, Freedom of Information filings. And it was really a trove of hundreds, thousands of documents about how US officials had deliberately lied to the people here and around the world about Afghanistan, about Iraq, about Libya, about Syria, about all of their wars directly and deliberately, even when among themselves they were circulating papers about the disaster that their wars were creating. Yet all the time they were declaring it was for peace, it was for democracy, and they were leaving any day. So that's how it also goes when they say they're going to investigate their police forces. It's a deliberate, intentional lie. It's meant just to forestall for a minute, while at the same time they have a policy of conscious destruction and division among the nationalities, and whether it's in Afghanistan or it's in Syria or it's in Iraq. Now, just to sum up, Afghanistan today, it is the poorest country in the world, the highest rate of illiteracy, of abuse of women, of inferior, disastrous health care, 80% of the population in rural areas where deaths are not even counted. So these are the figures that we want to be aware of when we're talking about what a great occupation this has been. Not for 1 minute, not for 1 day, nor has there been any improvement. I also just want to say that this is an empire that is today in complete decay and decline. It's dying. It can't solve the problems right here at home of COVID, of infrastructure, of systemic racism. It has no ability to deal with problems around the world. Its only question is, can it every minute maximize profit? It can't bring development to any country. There's been no improvement in the living standards in Afghanistan in those 40 years, worse deterioration. And you know what? Wages here in the US have been stable, flat, and declining in 40 years. So the wars come home, the military comes home, and our awareness and linking these struggles, that is what is important. We can only defeat this system with unity and solidarity that's consciously built. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Oh, excuse me. Thank you, Sarah. So at this time, we have a few announcements before we jump into our discussion and Q&A portion of the event. Excuse me here. Apologies for the delay. So firstly, Workers' World newspaper has been in continuous circulation since 1959. During the first months of the COVID-19 pandemic, the print edition was temporarily suspended, but we are happy to announce that we've resumed printing physical copies again on a monthly newspaper. You can subscribe to Received Workers' World newspaper by email at workers.org. Each week, we run a section, Tear Down the Walls, which is about the struggle for the abolition of the prison industrial complex. The Prisoners' Solidarity Committee of Workers' World Party has a long history supporting imprisoned members of our class. You can support this specific program to send free copies of Workers' World newspaper to incarcerated workers by going to patreon.com/WWP. At this time, I'd like to encourage all our panelists to go ahead and turn their cameras on, and maybe we can have a little bit of a discussion.
Okay, so thanks, Nate. So we do want to have all. We're actually not going to spotlight anyone at this point, and we're going to go back to a gallery view. So yes, thank you, great. And if all of the panelists could please turn on their videos. So we're going to start with. I am going to ask some questions sort of directly at people, but they are open for other people to make comments. So my first question, and my first
I
question.
cannot put on my video. There. Okay.
Okay, so tech people, if you could help people who aren't on video to get on video, that'd be great. So the first question is for Rhonda, and other people, of course, can comment. So what parallels can you draw from the US promises to withdraw from Afghanistan with the continuing US presence in the Philippines?
Yeah, well, I would never trust the US to ever fully remove themselves from anywhere voluntarily. I mean, I think, what Jeremy was talking about and what others have said, I think we can really expect to see private contractors there or US troops in there by other means. I think NATO will continue to have its presence there. And when I think about parallels with the Philippines, one of the things that the US did to ensure its military presence continued even after the formal end of the Philippines being a colony was to put in military agreements that assured the US of territory where they could base their troops, base their ships, base their now nuclear weapons. And so, I wouldn't be surprised if there are attempts at agreements like that. And then, of course, there's the proxies. And so, you have NATO's presence in Afghanistan. I think in the Philippines, the US actually conducts a lot of multilateral military exercises with military from Korea and Japan. So I think, those are the kinds of underhanded moves out in the open, right, that the US will use anywhere it is. And so, if the Philippines is any kind of example, I don't expect that we can ever, really believe that the US is going to leave Afghanistan entirely, at least not in a voluntary way.
Okay, so are there other speakers who would like to weigh in on this question, or it's sort of an open discussion if people have things that they want to add, and it could be, other places besides the Philippines.
Jeremy, earlier you were referencing the illegality of the initial U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, and I don't know if that's something you might want to expound on for a moment to kind of connect what's going on there now to the history of 20 years of occupation. and how that
Okay,
began.
well, I think international legal scholars have pointed out and analyzed the legality and found it to be illegal because now, assuming now we don't know what happened on 9/11, there's grounds, there are a lot of oddities and question marks about who was behind the 9/11. Assuming it was bin Laden and his group, now they were based in Afghanistan, but they were not sent by the Taliban. According to international law, from my understanding, they would have to have been sent by the Taliban to carry out those attacks. Now, it was never proven in a court that they even carried it out, but in assuming they did, they would have to have been sent by the Taliban, and they were not. The Taliban actually agreed to have bin Laden tried, but wanted an Islamic court, but they never supported, and there was no evidence that they sent bin Laden. In fact, I believe he had become a nuisance in Afghanistan. So there's no actual legality. And there are all these hidden motives that are rarely discussed, including the oil pipeline. If Unocal had this big pipeline project that was going forward, and Unocal, the Southern California company, and Hamid Karzai and Zalmay Khalilzad were consultants to that company. And it was a pipeline that would undercut Russia, and a pipeline through Central Asia. And that in the 90s is when they really began to covet Central Asia. With the breakup of the Soviet Union, the US empire really set its sights on controlling Central Asia and was courting some of the brutal dictators there. And there's all this untapped oil and natural gas. So that's one of the hidden agendas, that the war in Afghanistan provides a pretext for expanding the US military infrastructure in that whole region and not enabling access to Central Asia oil and gas resources and undercutting the Russians. Russia was very weak in the 90s under Boris Yeltsin, is becoming a bit stronger now under Putin. So and this group is very well attuned to the nature of the US empire and the interests that drive it. But I think the majority of the public is not, and the media frames it as all about terrorism. And as I said, most scholars of terrorism emphasize that terrorism takes root under foreign military occupation. So I think it's common sense that if you actually want to fight terrorism and stop terrorism, which is a noble goal, you should stop occupying countries. But that point is rarely raised by any mainstream commentator, even though it's basic common sense.
Okay. Thank you, Jeremy. We've had a couple of questions about, sort of like the first one I would like to direct at Makasi, but then I would like other people to sort of extrapolate, because we have New York and we have Minneapolis here on the phone very much. So the New York Police Department has the largest police budget in the US with over 10 billion annually. And can you talk about the militarization of major police forces? And why do you think New York's is so massive? You're on mute.
New York's is massive because it's the finance capital of the country, and really, the world, or it's the number one or number two, I don't know. But so again, if the goal is to protect the capitalist ruling class, you need the most guards where you have the most wealth. In terms of why the militarization of the police continues, this is a problem of capitalism. So capitalism is, in the US, it's immiserating people. It's moving people out of the sort of small business owner class, what journalists will usually call the middle class, to kind of confuse the issue. But people are being forced out of comfortable economic conditions into survival conditions, where they're forced to take very, very low paying jobs. And so that creates civil unrest, that creates new union drives, it creates general pressure for street action. And the only way to deal with that is to either, well, there's two ways to deal with it. One, you can make a concession, or two, you can use violence to suppress people. And the reality is that the capitalists aren't interested in making concessions. So violence is sort of the only way to do it. The other thing is that, the capitalists also don't have an unlimited amount of resources with which that they can provide concessions, right? And this ties into what's going on with Afghanistan, right? As soon as Jeremy said, as soon as the Soviet Union fell, all of a sudden capitalists turned their eyes to Central Asia. And the reason why they did that is because, they've strip mined the resources from other parts of the world. And capitalism requires constant growth. If you don't keep growing, your business is going to shut down. So the available markets and the available resources are constantly shrinking or being used up. And so the capitalists don't actually have the money to both make concessions to the workers and maintain their dominant position in the market, right? So they're sort of they've got to, if they want to do something logical and maintain the peace, they've got to give up their entire way of life. And so it makes much more sense from the perspective of the capitalists to militarize your police force and just use force.
Okay. Thank you, Makasi. So I was wondering, first of all, if anyone has anything else to talk about. I mean, obviously, we've seen the militarization of the police forces in the Twin Cities in response to the George Floyd protest and the verdict, and also in Brooklyn Center. So Autumn or Angel, if either of you want to weigh in on this. If not, I have a direct question for you. Angel, you are on mute, so you have to unmute yourself.
Okay. I could definitely start out with Project Safety Net, which is stupid as heck way of spending much needed money in our communities. We're talking about, people, I'm just saying this because I see a lot of it is like, we're talking about people that don't even have places to live, that are living in tents right now during a pandemic. And that money could have been used for housing, any type of kind of housing, as far as, even opening up temporary housing or whatever it may be. But it was a really waste of money to have all those cops and military come for what? They were expecting a riot. I mean, yeah, whatever. I mean, I don't know. I just feel like it was craziness. It was weird to see. I don't live too far from the BCA, which is the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. Like, I live like literally 3 blocks away from there. And it was just crazy to see like all this barbed wire and fencing and everything, and like just watching National Guard riding around in my neighborhood. And it just feeling kind of like, already with people who have probably, people that are already dealing with trauma because of what happened to George Floyd in our community. So it's like very difficult to, see the heavy presence of police and not be triggered by that.
Right. Thank you, Angel.
Mm-hmm.
Autumn, did you want to add anything?
I would love to. Okay. So with dating all the way back to 2014 with the Ferguson uprising, it seems as though every time a police killing of a Black person leads to an uprising, we find out that towns we've never heard of have armored vehicles and other military surplus equipment. Found out about that Kenosha, Wisconsin, has military surplus equipment, armored vehicles, all sorts of and this, of course, is because there is a federal program that allows police departments to obtain military surplus equipment, either that is no longer in use by the military or was never got to make it to a DoD installation to begin with. This, of course, is part of the police's role. As has been stated before, they are, enforcers of private property, of capital. They are not protectors of the people. So having the means to suppress people's movements requires state-of-the-art technology, as it turns out, because as I have heard angels say in person countless times, ain't no power like the power of the people, because the power of the people don't stop. One thing I'm thankful for, though, is that here in Minneapolis, we have proven that no amount of armored vehicles, no amount of tear gas, no amount of discipline no part of like military style discipline on the part of these heavily militarized police forces is enough to stop the power of the people. The reason that we even got this verdict in the Chauvin trial in the first place is because of the unrelenting will and presence of the people in the face of such an aggressively well-equipped force. We see the same kind of situation occur in places abroad where the United States has faced military defeat. You know, the United States is considered to be an overwhelming, well-equipped opponent, and yet, last I checked, they haven't been winning any wars lately. Last I checked, they got their asses handed to them in 1972. We've been at war in Afghanistan for 20 years. That's so wild. So while these departments are becoming increasingly militarized, and while they are getting that special training from military forces such as those in Israel, it's not an undefeatable foe. What it requires is unity of the people. When we're united in struggle, we are overwhelming in our numbers and in our power. So don't let those armored vehicles scare you.
Thank you, Autumn. Go ahead, Nate.
Thanks, everyone. I just wanted to ask Sarah, and we're going to need to be wrapping up in just a moment. I just wanted to ask Sarah, thank you for your tribute earlier to Ramsay Clark. One of the things he was known for was using his law experience to defend the official enemies of the United States, countries under attack from US wars and sanctions. Can you talk more about how the US uses methods like sanctions, methods other than traditional bombings and invasions, to wage wars on nations that it targets?
Yeah, because the military war is just one form of the war, and very much what was a focus of Ramsay Clark was talking about the sanctions imposed around the world, that when you enforce the starvation of an entire people and say that that's better than dropping bombs, and you convince a lot of people here too that that is somehow preferable, and yet the sanctions kill far, far more people. That was certainly true in Iraq, where 500,000 children in the first 4 years, 500,000 children under the age of 5 died of completely, diseases easily cured, except the medicine was blocked and the water wasn't potable. It's a killer. But it's now 39 countries, a third of the world's population, that is under US sanctions. It's staggering. And its impact is to intentionally unravel countries, make their development extremely difficult. At every point, shut down trade, shut down exchanges, shut down the ability to import, whether it's seed or fertilizers or chlorine to purify water, basic medicines. And in a time of COVID, it's beyond criminal. So this is a form of war. All the years of the US occupation of Afghanistan, the sanctions continued. There's still sanctions on Afghanistan and on Iraq, on Syria, on Libya still. So even after the war seemed to be over, or they claim some part of the troops are coming home, they are enforcing a complete strangulation of the economy. Even UN shipment of emergency aid's got to get passed. US permission. So we got to see how the forms of US warfare, and you could compare it to what happens in communities in the US. The old term was redlining, where entire neighborhoods and communities are literally written off and become food deserts also, we could say. But around the world, when you look at what's happening to a country like Venezuela, one of the potentially richest, able to supply from their own treasury, free, accessible health care for all, and now can't hardly import a pill. So addressing all the forms of warfare and saying this is a violation of international law, of humanitarian law, that says the targeting of civilians in every situation should always be prohibited. But it's assuming the US abides by law anywhere, and they don't. It's lawlessness, it's criminal, and it should be linked. Every one of these countries, there's a different excuse for every country. They'll say they're after this or that person who's bad, therefore the whole country's going to starve. And some you haven't a clue why there are sanctions, whether it's Guinea-Bissau or Laos or countries it's not in the news here, but why are they on that list of the 39 countries? As I say, a third of the world population. So denouncing it and linking it to the military wars is very important, and it's at a time when US military budgets are growing. They grow every single year because it's the biggest source of profit. It's the biggest source of profit, the military industry. So I'll wind up on that. Let's keep linking all of those struggles, and also right here fighting for unity among all peoples.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I know Makasi wanted to make a very brief statement, and then we really need to wrap up. So.
Yeah, well, someone in the question said that we were describing problems and not talking about solutions. And I just wanted to point out the problems are the result of the capitalist system. Therefore, the only solution is a socialist revolution, right? That is the solution. So you have to smash the repressive apparatus of the capitalists and overthrow the capitalist ruling class. And that requires organizing people and getting them together to do that. So, very briefly, but the answer is always the same. It doesn't matter what problem you're talking about in the capitalist system. The answer is revolution. But anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Makasi. Go ahead, Nate.
Thanks, Makasi. That's a wonderful setup for just some closing announcements. That, the most powerful tool, some would say the only tool that working and oppressed people have, is organization. So if you like what you heard tonight, please consider joining a revolutionary organization. And I confess that I'm very partial to a particular one, Workers' World Party, which has branches all across this country. So please go to workers.org/join and fill out the form you find there. An organizer will be in touch shortly. We also want to give a special shout out to our comrades and friends in Black Alliance for Peace, who hosted a virtual event tonight as well, just before our broadcast. Black Alliance for Peace has been instrumental in raising the demand to end the US occupation of Afghanistan once and for all. And we encourage our viewers to check out video of their event tonight at blackallianceforpeace.com.
And we also want to invite our viewers to tune in tomorrow night to a very important virtual event for political prisoner Mumia Abu-Jamal, who after 40 years in prison recently underwent, as I mentioned before, the open heart surgery, in addition to contracting COVID-19 behind the walls. Musicians, authors, activists, and organizers, including Tom Morello from Rage Against the Machine, Palestinian author and Workers' World Party member Susan Abulhawa, Dr. Robin D.G. Kelly, and Dr. Mark Lamont Hill, Michael Africa Jr., and many others will be on the program. Tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern, and hopefully someone can just drop it in the chat, visit letmumiaout.com for information on where to tune in. And then the next day, if you're on the East Coast. Saturday, April 24th is Mumia's, and it's not just the East Coast, is Mumia's 67th birthday. And we will be out in the streets in Philadelphia, New York City, in Oakland, San Francisco, Mexico City, Oaxaca, Johannesburg, Berlin, Paris, and many other cities across the world, demanding Mumia's immediate release from prison. Find an action near you at mobilizationformumia.com. And you can join us every Thursday at this time, 5 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Central, and 8 p.m. Eastern. Please make sure you don't miss our special event for May Day 2021, hosted by Workers' World Party's Labor Fraction at this time next week. Stay safe, get involved, get out and demonstrate this weekend, or watch it on Zoom, whatever you can do, and build a workers' world.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
panelists. You did a fantastic job.
Thank you.
Wonderful.